Hello, this is Greg Jeske, and this is Postdoc. And in this episode, we're talking with Nicki Vander Meulen, who was featured in the documentary Interdependence. Nicki, nice to have you along.
Thank you for inviting me, Greg. I really appreciate that.
All right, one of the first questions I have to ask everybody in this series of interviews with the timeliness of it is, how have you been doing in the last year with COVID?
COVID was a real challenge because as an individual with disabilities, the state of Wisconsin did not prioritize individuals with disabilities getting the vaccine. I'm lucky I was not immunocompromised, which was fortunate, but I basically moved back with my parents because my dad is 82, my mother's in her mid 70s, and I can't drive, so I couldn't take a cab, can't take the bus, no transportation.
And
So,
how are they doing?
they're doing really well, gotten both vaccines. I now have just had my second one on April 1st.
Okay.
Myself. But again, today was the first day individuals with disabilities not in long-term care or not in an IRIS program was able to get a vaccine. I got it early because I'm a public defender, and the other reason I could have gotten it, though I chose not to, was through the school board. It kind of says something when an elected official could get it before someone with a pre-existing medical condition.
How did this affect your work?
Everything was virtual.
Okay.
It had to be. The courthouse does not open up to the public until June 1st.
Okay.
But we still had to go in the jail, which means wrapping up in scarves, wrapping up in masks, double masking, making sure that you use as much sanitizer as possible. Yes, we are behind glass, but it's still a situation. The issue, though, is people who were in there had it far worse than I did, especially those with disabilities. And when you have minor offenses, which are death penalty offenses, obviously, gotta wonder the sense of keeping someone in there during COVID.
Any lessons that from this experience that strike you right off the bat here?
One, you have to realize that individuals with disabilities need to be seen as people. If you don't see them as people, you're not going to see them as needed to be vaccinated. Originally, we didn't count the number of dead who were disabled. They didn't even include it on the count. That's 5 states during this pandemic tried to take ventilators away from the disabled and passed laws saying that the intellectually disabled don't deserve ventilators. Wow. Multiple haven't allowed vaccines to be prioritized to the disabled. That class is still an incredibly large class. I'm not trying to whine, but people are dying. And they're dying because they don't have the access, or we're using internet services that aren't accessible for the blind. Half the websites weren't even ADA accessible. What are we saying as a society? That, well, in an emergency, we're not sure you count?
Talk about where we are, we as a nation, as it comes to the disability community, Nicki, after the Trump administration and now the beginning of a new administration. I know you have a few thoughts on that.
We can breathe again,
yeah.
In a way. And I know that sounds odd, but when you have a doctrine that says we want people who can lift themselves up on their own 2 feet. And the first thing you're thinking is, are they going to change the rules, not just for deportation, but in citizenship in general? People say they can't. Problem is, anything can be changed by law. We still can forcefully sterilize the disabled. It's still U.S. Supreme Court law in Buck v. Bell. That's never been overturned, and that's a 1924 case that says 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, and that is the court's ruling. That's the way the law stands.
Still today. Boy.
Yeah. It's a 1924 decision written by Bryant, William Jennings. No, I don't remember who wrote it, and I can't remember right now.
But Nicki, let's just to try to, use some legal jargon, we'll stipulate that the Trump administration might not have been the most compassionate towards people with disabilities. Name me a thing, though, that was repealed or something that was taken away, other than, just the general attitude, I guess. Was there something during the Trump administration that was done?
Yeah.
That is go ahead.
The use of having our Social Security, you had to go through additional Social Security checks to prove you were disabled enough to receive benefits. If you posted on social media and it showed you had too much gainful time, they could cut your benefits if they thought you should be working.
So,
Problem being is that ignores chronic fatigue, that ignores multiple disabilities, but that's what it deemed. So in a pandemic, we were going to have people whose entire livelihood was debated whether or not whether they were on Facebook or not.
so time on
Actually,
social media was a penalty.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. That's all of America almost then.
Yeah. So if you were on it too much, it could be said as, oh, why aren't you doing gainful activity if you could do that? Problem is, social media is how the disabled reach each other. Because when you can't drive there always, or you have other issues with communicating, this is a way to link it together. And that is what we are being punished for.
What about the new administration and the hopes you might have there? You say you can breathe again, but talk about, Nicki, what you would like to see done here with the Biden administration.
I want to see the end to the sub-minimum wage. We read a lot about the tipped wage as getting rid of the sub-minimum wage. They're not the same thing. Tipped wage is $2.13 an hour and needs to be changed. Sub-minimum wage is 4 cents an hour, and it could be actually any wage. Law was written, the Fair Wage Labor Act was written in 1938. And the 14C exception stated that you could pay veterans and individuals with disabilities slightly under minimum wage. 1986, it was changed by the Reagan Republicans to any given wage. Right now, there are 492 businesses that may have changed by now who use the sub-minimum wage in the state of Wisconsin. Most of them are charities. Easter Seals is one of them. Out of the ones that we give to, I give a shout out to the Madison Goodwill, who is one of the few Goodwills in the country that does not pay the sub-minimum wage and actually pays an actual living wage and doesn't force its workers into a sheltered workshop. And I thank them greatly for that because they took a stand on that. And that's not an easy stand to take.
Did you say 4 cents an hour, Nicki?
Yes.
Wow. And that is paid today to some people?
Correct. I was told the best I could hope for was $2 an hour with a law degree at Goodwill, and that I should be happy for that. And that was by my state disability council.
And that's the message that people with disabilities are often given, right? Don't expect much.
Yes. You should be happy you got this much. Don't complain. Well, I'm worth more than that. And I wasn't going to work in a sheltered workshop. I didn't work that hard to do that, and I have no problem with individuals having competitive work employment. But the sheltered workshop is taking advantage of individuals, and when it's supposed to be transitional work experience, yet only 5% ever get out of the 95% that in. 5%. That's a heck of a statistic.
Sure is. So we've kind of gone backwards and forwards with the political part of it, but another part of politics that I wanted to make sure we talked about here, Nicki, it was the voting numbers in 2020. Barely half of the people with disabilities voted.
65 million in the United States as a population of disabilities. We had about 35 million vote. That's it. Why? Because accessibility-wise, we're not doing what we need to be doing. The state of Wisconsin has removed some of the things that help blind voters and voters with visual impairments because they're worried on voter fraud. Having someone read a ballot to you is not voter fraud. That's a reasonable accommodation. That's not telling someone how to vote.
Okay.
It's facilitating the ability to vote. Also, our guardianship laws in this state and many others allow guardians to take away the right to vote from their ward. And you have to actually petition the court to get that back. So until 8 years ago, no one ever challenged it. So we have hundreds of people in a nursing home or group homes who are completely eligible to vote, who don't because they're told they don't have the right to. The ward says no, or likely the ward doesn't even know they gave up that right.
Mhm.
They just check the box.
Yeah. So what's the is there any kind of strategy
Yeah.
in terms of voter drive for 2024 now?
Yes, and there is it's called Crypt the Vote. It's not my choice of name, but I respect it just the same. Crypt the Vote, which is working on that. Also, the Disability Voter Coalition. Denise Jess from the Coalition of the Blind in Wisconsin has been working quite a bit with that organization to make sure that we are making out, not just reaching out to individuals with disabilities, but making sure how things are done. Right now, if these Jim Crow 2 laws, and that's what I'm going to call them, and I probably shouldn't, but that's what I'm going to call them, are horrible also for the disabled. Why? Because when you can't get there and you have to fight to decide who is infinitely confined. I've had friends whose food receipts have been scrutinized on whether or not they were confined enough for their absentee ballot vote. I'm sorry, no one should have to do that. They aren't medical, these politicians are not medical doctors. Why should they have the right to determine if I'm disabled enough? And what does that even mean?
What kind of what is the implication of that, of a political measurement of disabled enough?
What it means is they want to take the voice we have and to make sure that we're lesser than. By disabled enough, you're a lesser citizen. We state in the movie, it's almost like Jess states the movie, well, it's like a second-class citizen. And it really is. The people whose voting rights are going to be most affected, and that's why I call it Jim Crow too, are Black, brown, transgender individuals who are disabled and in wheelchairs. How many individuals in the state of Georgia with disabilities are going to be able to sit in or stand with assistance in a 4-hour line with no food or water? I don't know of many because I know I sure the heck couldn't. That's what we're doing. That's the people we are hurting. And those are actual citizens who've done, people have the right to express themselves, to be able to vote and pick. By doing this, you're saying that we are less than citizens, that we need to be, quote unquote, protected. Protected doesn't mean you take our voice. You don't take our ability to take our actions away from us. And you don't punish us because we chose to vote in a manner that is perfectly legal, perfectly safe, but caused you to lose an election. It doesn't mean it's illegal. It means you didn't get out the vote well enough.
You know, we talked about the 30th anniversary of ADA in 2020, and that was, you know, something that was marked by a lot of people in a lot of different ways. When that came around, how did it strike you? And when you know, when you look back at how long it's been there and what it's done and what hasn't been done with the ADA, Nicki, where do you see this standing?
Very simply, I wish we would have been a lot further than we're at. It doesn't include enough people of color. I agree. That has been a common criticism, and I agree. At the same point, there are some who have said that the ADA needs to stand aside for Black Lives Matter. We're part of Black Lives Matter. That's something I would fight and die for. We're not a race to the bottom. We are a race to keep everyone up and to help as many individuals that are humanly possible. And that the disability movement would have been crushed if it wasn't for the Black Panthers in the 504 protest. And if it wasn't for those Panthers, the 504 protest wouldn't have happened. Then the cap and crawl wouldn't have happened. Then the ADA would have never passed.
Tell that story real quickly, if you would, Nikki, just how the Black Panthers were involved with that, what you're referring to.
Yes. And the Panthers were involved because there was one individual who had MS, failed his draft physical, and realized he had MS. And he managed to organize a sit-in protest along with other sit-ins throughout the country. Sit-in in New York City failed immediately. The sit-in in Chicago failed immediately. Sit-in in Pittsburgh, or the HUD of the Housing and Education, it was called HUE at the time, Housing, Education, and Welfare, failed immediately. San Francisco protest didn't. Why did they not fail? Because of the Panthers bringing generators. They occupied the building for a month. They fed every single person there. They provided power for the wheelchairs. They kept the water from being turned off. That doesn't happen. 504, which is Section 504 of the Civil Rights Act, has no teeth. Then no one could sue for civil rights discrimination on the basis of disability. We don't have that happen, and we are going to end up without any programs. And the ADA still almost didn't pass. It took hundreds of people, led by an 8-year-old named Jennifer, whose last name I should remember and I don't, who crawled out of her wheelchair and led what was known as the Capitol Crawl, of people in their wheelchairs who crawled up the Capitol stairs of the U.S. Capitol, which was completely inaccessible, to protest the fact that there was no way to get in the building. That was in 1990, not 1960, not 1970, 1990. I was 12 years old when that bill passed. I could be thrown out of school before that, and was it when I was 3. I was thrown out of preschool because I couldn't walk right. I was told that I had to sue to get into public school because I was told that they didn't have to provide an education for me, even though IDEA existed. No one ever really had any teeth. IDEA being the Individual Disability Education Act. So when you do that, you realize how lucky you are. Or people, you'll often hear, well, other countries are so much better. This is the only country in the world that has a Bill of Rights for the disabled. It has a lot more to go. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's the only one in the entire world that exists. And that's
I'm glad you brought that up, Nikki. I find the international perspective, because I think we do. It's easy sometimes in the United States to go, we're treating this group very poorly, and if compared to the rest of the world, we're really doing a poor job. And sometimes you find out that the rest of the world isn't really any better, and that it is a global problem. And for people with disabilities, it seems to be the case.
During the Trump administration, I looked at countries which I could move to in case things got too anti-disability for me to live here. No one but the state of Israel would take me, and that's only because I'm Jewish. Canada, I cost more than $40,000 in my lifetime for care, so I'm not allowed. Italy, not allowed. France, not allowed. New Zealand has a specific act banning autistic specifically, and actually has codified it into the law.
Wow.
Australia has canceled multiple visas of people working because their children are autistic, because it would cost the state too much money. When you realize that where you are born can determine what your quality of life is. When I went to Vietnam and realized a country that I absolutely had studied and thought I would love dearly, that if I was born there, I would have been a beggar. That's where the accommodation levels were. And yes, they're getting better, but it's a far cry from a law degree. And people don't always understand that, and they don't always see it.
You know, I hear that, and I look back at the documentary we did, Interdependence, and it just seems to there's just so much more to be told, and there's it's a movement that's really not in existence for so many people around the world, and yet how are those people, how are things ever going to change for people with disabilities in other parts of the world? I mean, is there even any semblance of a movement in those places?
Yes. Hong Kong and in certain parts of China, the mothers got together and banded together for their children and demanded it because of the one-child policy.
Mm-hmm.
Because people were aborting, so they didn't want a disabled child because they were only allowing one child. And mothers got together and stated, "You will treat my child with respect." And it has started to gain steam in Southeast Asia. It's starting to gain steam in other nations, in India as well, slowly. Problem being is we don't always know how much time you're going to have. We just saw with the global pandemic how much we can lose and how fast. This is an urgency problem. This is something that needs to be done now. Can't be, oh, when we get to it. Often when we see the disabled, we see something as, oh, when we finish everyone else. I've had it told to me multiple times. Individual who no longer works with the district openly stated when I asked on security plans, he told me privately, well, we got to work for everyone else's, then we can get to the disabled. Excuse me, what am I? An alien? Foreign life form? UFO? I mean, I'm still a person. Building is burning. I want to make sure I could get out. I mean, those are the kind of things you kind of worry about. I'm in the darn school board. And that was 2 years ago.
Yeah. Well, Nicki, I want to wrap up this session with finding out where you are professionally, because in the documentary our last note at that point was the fact that you were going to be running for state assembly here in Wisconsin. So for those of us who weren't following along after that, kind of pick it up from there.
I did not win state assembly. Francesca Hong did an amazing job and is an amazing representative. I will be glad to eventually try that again in some years in the future. But let's be honest, it wasn't my time to do it because I'm needed more on the school board. I was going to try and do both, and I'm now seeing that would not have been as possible as I thought. The amount of workload that I do on school board, plus running a law office, would have had to close the law office. I'm not sure that would have been as successful as I thought it could be because of a time commitment.
Right.
But that doesn't mean I give up my political aspirations. I don't. Just means I'm rethinking it.
And as far as you are still, like you said, on the Madison School Board.
Yep. Got elected in my second term. Was elected April 7th, was Schrodinger's candidate for 1 week because since we had an in-person election in the middle of a pandemic, we couldn't open the ballots for a week so literally I was the closest thing to Schrodinger's candidate as you could have. I was both a school board member and not simultaneously. And then on April 14th, I found out that I had won my second term and I really enjoy the work. Mm-hmm. Enjoy fighting for all students, enjoy fighting for our staff, for our teachers, and it's been a very good experience.
Well, Nicki, best to you in those fights and in the aspects of your life that aren't always fights as well.
Yes, I just got a new kitten who's wonderful. His name is Vinny, black and white kitten, love of my life. He's great. Likes to watch college basketball with him.
Perfect. Well, Nicki Vander Meulen, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Postdoc. It was wonderful catching up.